Good evening all and welcome to day 2 of Ghost Week. Even more paranormal stories for you tonight. Don't forget to sub and check in on us for the rest of the week for even more spooks. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My family's beach house had always carried a reputation among us for being a little unusual. Over the years, strange things would happen. Objects would vanish without explanation, only to reappear in the oddest places. Doors would slam open and shut seemingly on their own, and light bulbs had an unnerving habit of exploding randomly. I was convinced the house was haunted, specifically by my late grandfather, who had loved the place dearly and spent much of his life there. Whenever I brought up these incidents, though, no one seemed to take me seriously. My family would dismiss my concerns as overactive imagination or just one of those quirky things of an old beach home. For a long time, I felt like I was the only one noticing or experiencing the activity. But that all changed one summer, when a contractor was hired to do some renovations on the house. I wasn't there when it happened, but the story quickly made its rounds through the family. The contractor called my dad in a state of utter disbelief. He had been working with his table saw in the living room when mid-task, the saw disappeared. Confused and increasingly uneasy, he searched the house from top to bottom, only to find it later in a completely different room he hadn't been in. He hadn't moved it, no one else had been there, and he couldn't make sense of how it could have happened. That incident must have rattled him because he told my dad he didn't want to continue working on the house. His exact words were something along the lines of, "There's something wrong with that place." It was enough to get my dad to admit that the contractor wasn't alone in his experience. To my surprise, my dad confessed that strange things had been happening in the beach house for years. He hadn't said anything because he didn't want to scare anyone or seem superstitious. He revealed that several workmen hired in the past had quit abruptly, saying they felt uncomfortable. The table saw incident was the tipping point. It validated my own experiences, and finally everyone seemed to believe me. The more we thought about it, the more it made sense. My grandfather had adored that beach house. It was his sanctuary, a place filled with his happiest memories, and he had poured his heart into maintaining it. Perhaps in some way, he wasn't ready to leave it behind. My husband of 25 years and I shared an unsettling experience one night many years ago, in the 2-story house he had owned before our marriage. It was after midnight, and the neighborhood was its usual quiet self. No traffic, no commotion, and certainly no neighbors known for causing a stir. The streets were deserted, and the air had the stillness unique to late-night hours. As we lay in bed, we heard something, the soft murmur of a child's voice cutting through the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, a little girl's voice as gentle as a whisper calling out, "Mama?" I froze, my heart racing as I strained to process what I had just heard. For a moment I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination, an echo of some forgotten thought. But then, as if choreographed, my husband and I both rolled over to face each other. He looked as shaken as I felt. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. My stomach knotted. I needed to be sure that I wasn't losing my mind. "What did you hear?" I regretted asking that as soon as it was at my mouth, and his answer sent chills down my spine. "I heard a little girl saying Mama." It couldn't have been my daughter, who was 26 at the time. She was spending the weekend with her father, more than an hour away, and the house was empty, except for the two of us. We eventually settled down, but the memory of that voice lingered. Over the next 3 years in that house, our lives seemed to reflect the eerie undercurrent of that moment. We argued constantly, vicious fights that felt disproportionate to the situations at hand. There was no physical violence, thankfully, but the arguments left emotional scars, and the atmosphere in the house seemed to fuel our tension. I often felt cold in the home, no matter how warm the weather was outside. The air seemed dense with weight, almost oppressive. Those were dark days, too many for newlyweds supposed to be basking in the glow of their first years of marriage, and after 3 painful years we decided to move. The house stands to this day, though it looks very different now, as the new owners decided to give it a complete makeover, and I think they had the right idea in doing so. I wonder if the house is still infested with that dark energy, which I can only say happened after we heard that painfully chilling word. 15 years ago, I had an experience in a hotel room that made me believe in ghosts. I was in my mid-20s living in Denver, and on a whim decided to take a road trip to Aspen. It was a last-minute decision, just me and my loyal companion Baxter, a 50-pound protector of a dog. I had Monday off unexpectedly, so I left work Friday afternoon, eager for an adventure. At the time, I didn't have much money, so instead of staying in Aspen, I opted for a more affordable motel in the town of Basalt. Basalt is a charming little mountain town with a rich mining history, and the motel was nothing fancy, just a basic room to rest my head. I arrived around 9 p.m. and noticed the parking lot was packed with construction vehicles. That struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. After checking in, I walked Baxter to a nearby liquor store, grabbed a 6-pack of beer and settled in for the night. I drank 2 beers, watched some TV, and fell asleep around 11 p.m. I've always been a deep sleeper and rarely wake up in the middle of the night, but something stirred me. As I slowly came to, I felt movement. Both Baxter and I were shifting restlessly, and that's when I saw him. A man in my hotel room. He appeared suddenly coming from the direction of the entry door, but I hadn't heard the door open. One moment the room was empty, and the next he was just there walking slowly through the space. He looked ordinary, rugged even, like a working man. He was white with dark hair, clean-shaven, and dressed in neat but practical clothes, carrying a metal lunchbox and a thermos, which gave me the impression he might be an engineer or someone in a similar field. At first I stayed still, just lifting my head slightly from the pillow as I tried to process what I was seeing. Baxter, laying at my feet, was fixated on the man but made no sound. My mind raced, and before I could even form a coherent thought, the man noticed me watching him. He smiled a very friendly smile, as though to reassure me he meant no harm, but his presence was so unexpected, so out of place, that my body tensed in alarm. I instinctively thought, "Oh no, stay away." He seemed to read my expression because his face shifted to one of annoyance, as if to say, "I wasn't going to hurt you, I was just being friendly." Without a word, he turned sharply and continued his slow walk through the room. I watched frozen as he passed by my bed and disappeared through the wall separating my room to the next. As soon as he vanished, I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. On the other side, I heard the muffled sound of men talking, several voices casual and conversational. It sounded like a group of construction workers sharing a room. Baxter and I'd stayed quiet the entire time. He seemed stressed, his ears twitching as he looked around the room. But eventually we calmed down and lay back to sleep, which eventually did come. When I woke the next morning, the neighboring room was empty, the construction workers gone, and I was too shaken and honestly too shy to mention what had happened to the motel clerk. I just wanted to check out, load Baxter into the car, and spent the day hiking in the mountains before driving back to Denver. It's hard to put into words what I felt during that encounter. The man didn't seem malicious, just there, moving through my room as if it were his own space. I got the sense he wasn't expecting to be seen, and was as surprised as I was when our eyes met. The fear I felt wasn't because of him specifically. It was the shock of witnessing something that I just couldn't explain. The fact that Baxter reacted, and that the men in the next room seemed disturbed as well, makes me think that it wasn't a dream. And I never stayed in Basalt again. Growing up, I often felt like my house might be haunted, though I always tried to rationalize the strange things that happened, because Ghosts don't exist, right? The activity was subtle, nothing dramatic or frightening. There were odd noises, sudden cold spots, and items disappearing only to reappear later in the exact spot I'd swore I'd checked. Still, I chalked it up to my imagination or a coincidence. The first major event that made me pause was when a heavy metal door in the house, which had been securely shut, opened on its own. My mum and I were outside at the time, talking about my grandpa who had recently passed away. The timing felt significant. He was born and raised in that house and had lived there for many years. It also felt personal because his mother, my great-grandma, had passed away in the kitchen of that same house. For years I kept trying to explain away the strange occurrences, but in 2021 I started diving into paranormal topics out of curiosity, and since then I've experienced more moments that I can only describe as unexplainable. I sometimes wonder if it's because I've opened myself up to the idea of ghosts, or if I'm just more attuned to noticing things now. The experience that truly solidified my belief in the paranormal happened during a vacation at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. I was staying there with my uncle, though we had separate rooms on different floors. And after a day of shopping, I returned to my room only to find my key card wasn't working. I went down the front desk, and the shift manager said it was probably a battery issue with the door lock. She assured me maintenance would be sent up to fix it. Maintenance never showed, so I returned to the lobby where the same woman issued me a new keycard. This one didn't work either. Frustrated, I spoke with another hotel employee who checked the card and told me something strange. The card I had been using wasn't even registered to my room number. According to their records, I should never have had access to it. Finally, they gave me the proper keycard and I was able to get access to my room. I was rushing to get ready for a dinner reservation, so I changed quickly and sat down to tie my shoes. That's when I noticed it. A shadow on the white wall of the bedroom. It was the silhouette of a man wearing a hat, walking steadily before fading away. Confused and curious, I tried to recreate the shadow by walking in different areas of the suite. I realized it matched the path somehow, and would take away if they walked from the window in the living room area towards the door leading to the hallway. No one else was in the room, and I couldn't explain what I saw. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of a faint clicking noise. Too tired to investigate, I went back to sleep. In the morning, as I was getting to leave, I froze. My door was locked from the inside, a habit I never do because I'm always afraid of accidentally trapping myself. Then it hit me. The noise that had woken me up during the night was the sound of the door being engaged. Since then, I've stayed at other supposedly haunted locations, including a well-known haunted hotel in Chicago, where a lot of strange things happened. However, I sometimes wonder if I notice more because I'm aware of the reputation of these places. Even so, the Flamingo incident stands out because I had no prior knowledge of paranormal activity there, and it makes the experience all the more chilling. Several years ago, I had an experience that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It all began one ordinary evening while I was cooking dinner. My husband mentioned he wouldn't be able to eat with me because he had a meeting. So I finished preparing the meal, served myself a plate, and went into the dining room. My kitchen is quite small, with a narrow hallway that leads directly into the dining room. As I turned into the hallway, plate in hand, I was startled to see a tall man standing there. He was impeccably dressed in a tuxedo and wearing a top hat, looking like he had stepped straight out of another era. Without giving it much thought, I instinctively said, "Excuse me," as I passed him, continuing on to the dining room. But at that moment, when I crossed him in the room, I froze. My mind raced as I realized what had just happened. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the house. Who had I just spoken to? From that day onward, strange and unsettling events began to happen more frequently. Every time I cleaned the stairs, I felt a force pushing me, as if an invisible hand was shoving me from behind. At first, I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and more forceful. One day the push was so strong that I tumbled down the stairs, nearly cutting my tongue with my teeth during the fall. It was no longer something I could just ignore. Desperate for answers, I confided in my deeply religious neighbor, and when I described my experience and the man I had seen, her face grew serious. She revealed that her young grandchild had also seen a man fitting the same description, a tall figure in a suit and a top hat, sitting casually on the wall outside her home. The similarities were too exact to dismiss as mere coincidence. Concerned, my neighbor shared the story with her church congregation, and a group of them decided to visit my home one day and pray and address whatever was causing the disturbance. As they gathered in prayer, an eerie, unexplainable phenomenon occurred. The sound of horses and clanking chains echoed up and down the street, as though someone or something were being dragged along the road. The noises were clear and undeniable, making everyone quite scared. Although I didn't participate in the prayers, something seemed to shift after that day. The noises stopped, and the unsettling events like the pushing on the stairs finished completely. Life returned to normal, and the Hat Man has never been seen again, and I'm grateful for it. I rented a house from a friend a few years ago. At first, everything seemed perfectly fine. I have 3 cats and they settled in quickly. The first month passed without any issues, but things started to feel strange by the second month. Almost every night, my cats began acting oddly. They would fixate on hallways, watching intently, as if something invisible were moving down towards the bedrooms. Sometimes I'd be sitting on the couch watching TV with all 3 cats snuggled around me. Suddenly their heads would snap up in unison and they'd stare over my shoulder towards the same spot behind me. Then, as if tracking something, their eyes would follow whatever it was as it moved down the hall. At first I tried to brush it off as a quirky thing that cats do, but it kept happening almost nightly. By the 6th month, things took a turn from strange to downright unsettling. It started with little things, like waking up at 4 a.m. to find the shower running full blast. I was confused, but assumed it must have been a plumbing issue, or that I had absent-mindedly left it on. Though, deep down, I knew it wasn't the case. Then I began coming home from work to find the fridge and oven wide open, both doors gaping as if someone had been rummaging through them. My cats, who are normally curious and friendly, would be hiding under the bed, visibly scared. Not long after, I started waking up to find all the faucets in the house running, the kitchen, the bathroom sinks, even the bathtub. No one else had access to the house, and I couldn't come up with a logical explanation for it. The final few weeks before I moved out were the most chilling. I began to hear soft, distant laughter, like the sound of children giggling, even though I lived alone. The laughter wasn't constant, but it came often enough to leave me uneasy. It would happen late at night or in the early hours of the morning, echoing faintly through the house. When I decided to move, I bought a house directly across the street, and after I moved out, the rental house stayed vacant for quite some time. No one seemed interested in renting it, though I didn't share my experience with anyone. Despite the empty house, I would occasionally see shadows moving inside through the windows. They looked like people walking around, but the house was supposed to be unoccupied. Even now, when I look back on my time at the house, I can't explain what the strange activity, the cat's behaviors, and those eerie shadows were, leaving me with more questions than answers. I have a few ghostly encounters to share, which all took place in The Hague, Netherlands. The first was an encounter in the park. There's a small park that circles a cemetery, a peaceful spot where I often went jogging. One day, while running through the wooded area, I turned a corner and caught sight of a huge dog-like creature disappearing around the next bend. The thing was massive, much larger than any normal dog, and its movement was smooth and eerily deliberate. I picked up my pace and rounded the corner, only 10 seconds later expecting to see it, but it was gone. There was no trace of it, and the park was too small for something that size to vanish without a sound or sign. It left me unnerved every time I jogged thereafter. This next story is when I worked as a security officer, and one of my assignments was at the US ambassador's residence. This stately house had an undeniable presence, and strange things often happened there. Our security lodge was a small brick room attached to the outside of the house, complete with 2 windows, a frosted glass door, and several camera monitors. We were not allowed inside the house without explicit permission and clearance from US Marines stationed at the consulate, but even from the lodge, it was clear the house wasn't ordinary. During my first week on the job, I noticed lights flashing on and off inside the house when it was empty. Confused, I called the Marines for permission to investigate, and one of them laughed and said, "Oh, that's just the ghosts, don't bother." He treated it as a joke, but I wasn't so sure. The security lodge itself wasn't immune to strange activity. At times there would be loud, distinct knocks on the frosted glass door, but when I would look through the glass, there'd be no one there. Lights inside the house would turn on without any explanation, even though it was unoccupied. During my rounds, I would oftentimes see figures standing in the window. I'd check the same spot later, and the figure would be gone. Even on the cameras, ghostly entities would occasionally appear. Shadowy shapes moved through rooms, and one of the most memorable incidents involved a co-worker. He was sitting in the security lodge late at night when he saw one of those ghostly figures enter the lodge. Panicked, he bolted out of there and ran straight to the Marines stationed outside the property, and he refused to go back in. In the garden at the back of the residence, there was a simple bench. For reasons no one could explain, this spot was notorious for sightings. People, including my co-workers, often reported seeing figures sitting on the bench or shadowy presences lingering around it. The stories became so frequent that the bench was eventually removed. When the ambassador and his wife were away, a house-sitter would stay at the residence. Without fail, every house-sitter ended up joining us in the security lodge after dark. They all admitted to feeling too scared to stay alone in the house at night. These experiences, coupled with what I witnessed personally, convinced me that the ambassador's residence was truly haunted. I once took a cruise from Montreal, Canada to Boston, Maine, sharing a room with my sister. Our room happened to be on the same floor as the ship's hospital. For the first few nights, everything felt normal, and I had no reason to think twice about our location. On the second or third night at around 10:30 p.m., I woke up to see a figure standing near the closet. It was faintly illuminated, like someone holding a phone up to their face. Half asleep, I assumed it was my sister and just said, "Go back to bed." From the other side of the room, her irritated voice replied, "What are you talking about? Stop it." My stomach sank as I realized she was still in her bed. When I looked back at the closet, the figure was gone. I sat frozen, unsure of what I'd just witnessed, my heart pounding like thunder in the darkness. The next morning, as I left the room, I noticed a gurney being wheeled towards the hospital. A person lay on it, fully covered by a sheet. I tried not to let my thoughts spiral, but later as we disembarked, I saw an ambulance driving slowly away without its lights on. In the passenger seat was a woman, silently crying into her hands. Even now I can't help but wonder if the figure in my room was someone who had passed away on the ship. Were they trying to communicate or simply lost? I don't know, but the feeling had left me shaken and reminded me of how thin the line between life and death can feel. My 10-year-old daughter had always been a sleep talker, sometimes even sitting up and looking around while asleep. One evening she dozed off on the couch, and about 15 minutes later she abruptly sat up and said, "Where did it go?" I tried to soothe her, replying, "It's okay, honey, go back to bed." She lay back down, but asked again, "Where did it go?" "Go back to sleep," I repeated. At that moment, I heard a man's voice, loud and forceful, say, "No." It sounded like it came from right in front of me. I froze, my heart racing, and glanced at my daughter, who had already fallen back asleep. My husband was in our bedroom on the other side of the house, so it couldn't have been him. The voice was so close, so real, and so angry I couldn't comprehend it. I later remembered the history of the house. A man had passed away in our living room in 2017. Before that, in 1986, a man across the street shot his wife in the driveway. To add to the eerie context, we lived next to a cemetery, literally right next door. And despite all of this, I had never felt spooked in our home until that night. I didn't tell my daughter about what happened. I didn't want to frighten her. However, later I asked if she had ever had dreams about ghosts or if she thought the house was haunted, and she casually replied, "Well, there were the dimes." I had forgotten about the dimes. My daughter had a peculiar habit of finding dimes around the house. She'd often be in the kitchen when I'd hear the distinct sound of a coin hitting the floor. She'd pick it up, say, "Thanks, Jeff," and add it to her collection. We didn't use cash often, and she had a reloadable cash card, so the source of these dimes was a mystery. Jeff was the name of the man who had passed away in our living room. He was a kind and friendly man, and we had always joked that if he were to haunt us, he'd be a friendly ghost, leaving behind small tokens like dimes. Even our 3 boxer dogs reacted that night. My husband told me the dogs had woken him up, scratching at the bedroom door, something they never did. They usually piled into bed with us. Their behavior added another layer to the unsettling events. A few days later, my daughter asked, "Do you think people can talk to ghosts?" Her question seemed innocent enough, but I wondered if it was influenced by the Beetlejuice movie she'd seen recently. I answered honestly, telling her my grandfather used to say, "If someone says they saw something, never dismiss it because you never know." She then asked about my grandfather, the one who had worked at Roswell. Did he believe in aliens and ghosts? She said. I told her he did, and even had a favorite author who wrote about the supernatural, though my grandmother had dismissed it as nonsense. My daughter pondered this and said, well, she wasn't lucky enough to see that sort of stuff. While nothing unusual had happened since that night, the voice still lingers in my memory. It was forceful, almost angry, and unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Thankfully, my daughter has been completely unfazed, and I've started sleeping better again. However, the dimes and the voice leave me questioning what truly might be lingering in our home. I became a true believer in the paranormal the night my grandmother died. I was 10, lying on my bed. That's when I saw her above me. She looked just as I remembered, soft grey curls in her favourite blue cardigan, but there was something ethereal about her. I was frozen, unable to speak, and when I finally screamed, she vanished. I told myself it had to be a dream, but moments later I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my stomach, so sudden and intense it left me gasping. Then the phone rang from the top of the stairs. I heard my mother sobbing, and that's when I learned my grandmother had passed away unexpectedly. She hadn't been sick. I tried to explain it away over the years. Was it my imagination, a coincidence? But deep down I know what I saw and felt that night. I think it was probably her way of saying goodbye, seeing me one last time before she departed the mortal world forever. This encounter happened in the 1886 Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, a place steeped in a long, dark history. It was originally built as a luxurious retreat for the wealthy to bathe in the supposed healing springs. It later became a girls' school and eventually a cancer hospital. Under the guise of healing, patients were tortured with horrific experimental treatments, while their families were deceived by fake letters claiming their loved ones were improving, when in reality they were often dying. The ghosts of the past seemed to linger in the halls, and my wife and I got a taste of that one night. We had taken the hotel's ghost tour, which was an interesting experience, though not overly chilling. We had the opportunity to visit the old morgue where the infamous doctor would dissect the dead. One part of the hotel, known as the pain wing, was where he would hide patients who were crying out in agony, behind soundproof walls. My wife, ever intrigued, wanted to go back there for another look. When we reached the hallway leading to that section, we saw a stern-looking woman standing halfway down the corridor blocking the wing. She was holding what appeared to be a clipboard, her posture rigid and unyielding. At first we thought she was just a guest or staff member, but as she turned to look at us, her gaze was icy and full of disdain. Without a word, I turned to leave, and my wife swears the moment the woman snapped her head towards us, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, as though it were broken. What really struck me, however, was her posture, perfectly straight like a ramrod. People don't stand like that anymore. She was tall and thin, her skin unnaturally pale, wearing a long-sleeved white top tucked into a long black skirt. Her dark hair pinned up tightly, giving off a strict governess vibe. But there was an undeniable fury in her expression. The fear I felt wasn't the fear of danger, but the kind of fear you feel when you're caught doing something you shouldn't, like being caught sneaking around by a principal. At that moment we assumed she was alive, likely annoyed by us snooping around. We're not the type to easily be deterred by grumpy guests or staff, and it wasn't like we were in a restricted area. But the energy around her was so strong that we were immediately repulsed. Her presence felt like a firm get out, but we tried to keep our composure and started towards the spiral stairs. That's when the weirdness escalated. As I turned to go down the stairs, a woman with brown hair, pinned up like the first's, suddenly stepped in front of me, cutting me off. It was so abrupt I thought she was being rude, appearing out of nowhere, but just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, like she had stepped aside. I was left standing there, confused, as if I had just experienced a glitch in the fabric of reality. We were alone in the hallway, so there was no confusion about her identity. As we began to descend the stairs, the sound of quick footsteps echoed behind us, stomping down. The stairs, notorious for their history of deadly falls, weren't particularly noisy when walked on, but these stomps shook the entire staircase, reverberating in a way that felt wrong. Still thinking this was a living person, we moved to the side to let her pass, and as soon as we did, the stomping stopped, and the presence dissipated with a whoosh. The energy drained from us immediately, leaving us utterly exhausted for the rest of the night. We reached the bottom of the stairs and looked back, realizing that there hadn't been anyone behind us. That's when the truth hit us. We had encountered a ghost. We were on the second floor heading to the first, so there was no way she could have simply gotten on a different floor. We hadn't been alone on the stairs, and I distinctly saw the back of her head and the white of her neck. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor an illusion. We walked straight out of the hotel, not stopping to talk about it or investigate further, which was completely out of character for us. We're usually morbidly curious, the type to poke around, even in uncomfortable situations, but this was different. A rude person would never chase us off like that. I've since come to believe that the woman we encountered was likely Theodora, the head nurse at the hospital, who, under mysterious circumstances, died while working there. Her ghost is said to haunt the hotel, mostly around her old room on the top floor. Witnesses have described her as being strict, to the point of organizing guests' belongings if they were too messy. The artistic rendering of her, based on various accounts, matches the exact woman we saw. A pale, stern figure with an air of authority. What really struck me, though, was how real she felt. We often imagine ghosts as transparent or shadowy, but Theodora looked as solid and alive as anyone. She seemed completely aware of us, almost as though she knew exactly what we were doing and didn't like it. If she was a ghost, she was without a doubt the most powerful and compelling spirit I've ever encountered. It was a cold night, the mist hanging low over a lonely stretch of road. 8 of us riding 3 motorcycles. We'd only had a few beers, just enough to feel a little lightheaded but nothing crazy. The road hugged the coastline, with dark woods on one side and the sea on the other. It was around 1:30 a.m, and we were cruising at a steady 50 miles an hour, enjoying the quiet of the night. That's when we saw it. Up ahead, the 2 bikers leading the group spotted a bicycle in the distance. As we got closer, we could make out 2 figures, one riding the bike and another sitting on the back. The passenger was holding an old-fashioned oil lamp, casting a dim, flickering light. Both were dressed in loose white clothes, their faces unclear in the mist. It struck me as odd. There was nothing around for miles, no towns, no houses, no people walking or cycling at this hour. The nearest town was 35 miles ahead, and the last one was 50 miles behind. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere on a bicycle? We passed them without saying anything, slightly uneasy, but chalking it up to just one of those weird things you see on the road sometimes. We went back to our usual pace, feeling the wind and cold night air as we sped along. 15 minutes later, the guy riding at the back of the convoy noticed something in his rearview mirror. He nudged his partner and told him to look. When the rider glanced back, his blood ran cold. The same 2 figures on the bicycle were still behind us. Maybe 20-30 feet away. The lantern was unmistakable, swinging gently as they pedaled along, their clothes still as white and loose as before. We had been riding for about 50 minutes at 50 miles an hour. Simple math meant we had covered at least 12 miles since we overtook them. For them to be behind us, they would have had to have kept up with our speed, 50 miles an hour, on a bicycle. 2 men. It didn't make sense. The rest of us saw it too. Looks were exchanged, but no one said a word. Whatever was happening wasn't natural. The air felt heavier, like the mist was closing in on us. Without a second thought, we sped up, pushing the bikes faster, the roar of the engines filling the silence. None of us dared to look back again until the faint lights of the next town appeared in the distance. When we finally stopped in town, we didn't say much, just lit a cigarette with shaky hands and tried to act normal. After a few minutes, we all got back on our bikes and rode the remaining 40 miles home. For a long time, none of us mentioned what we saw that night. It took years for us to talk about it. We had a ghost experience that was as bizarre as it was entertaining. We didn't know her name, and I never actually saw her, but my wife, who was a sensitive, did catch a glimpse of her a few times. She had a habit of sighing audibly at our choices of television, occasionally even letting out an exaggerated of disapproval. We nicknamed her Laundry, because her presence was always accompanied by the unmistakable scent of freshly cleaned laundry. Laundry had strong opinions, particularly about TV shows. If she didn't approve of what we were watching, she'd turn the channel, always to the same program. My Three Sons, an old comedy from the 1960s. We usually let her have her way unless it was a Nickelodeon marathon, when we dared to change the channel. The fresh laundry scent would vanish, leaving a distinct impression that she was less than pleased. One cold morning I had decided to sleep in. The dogs and I were snug in bed, and I faintly remember hearing my wife leave for work early, rattling off some, "Honey, can you do this?" I half listened but agreed to anyway. About an hour later, the bed shook slightly and I heard a woman's voice directly above me. Brett, get up or you're going to be late. Groggy and annoyed, I assumed it was my wife, Carol, so I started snapping at her before even opening my eyes, but when I did I froze. All 3 dogs were wide awake, calmly but sitting alertly towards the end of the bed. That's when it hit me. The voice wasn't Carol, it was her. The very same familiar, slightly exasperated voice that sighed and from time to time in the TV room. My heart raced as I turned my head towards the end of the bed, terrified of what I might see. But thank God there was absolutely nothing. Still, the encounter shook me, and I've never gotten out of bed, showered, shaved, and left the house so quickly in my 22 years we lived there. I never saw Laundry, but her presence and influence was undeniable. My wife once told me we had at least 3 ghosts in the house. She'd often mutter things like, "Get out the damn doorway," or "The bathroom is off limits, you know." She insisted Laundry was the most harmless of the bunch, just a little quirky. Funnily enough, after 23 years of marriage, my wife and I ended up separating. She was the smart one. She probably sensed my life was about to take a sharp turn for the worse, and it did. Looking back, I wonder if Laundry worked on that too. We managed to capture Laundry in a couple of old photos back in the day of printed film. Somewhere, buried deep in boxes of photos I've held onto over the years, those images are waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe one day I'll find them again, if she lets me. This happened when I was 17. An entity had a habit of messing with the environment, constantly flicking off the lights, opening and closing doors, and on occasion I would hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway, though no one was ever there. At first I tried to ignore it, but it became increasingly unnerving. The spirit seemed to take pleasure in scaring me, and after some time I was exhausted by the constant disturbances. One night while I was home alone and chatting with friends on Skype, the ghost started his usual antics. The lights began to flicker, doors creaked open, and I could hear those eerie footsteps approaching. I had had enough. Furious and frustrated, I shouted at the entity, demanding that he leave me alone and go elsewhere. This was my home, I told him, and he wasn't welcome to torment me like this anymore. For a moment everything fell silent. It felt as though I had won, but that brief respite was short-lived. Suddenly I was overwhelmed by the sound of a fierce storm raging, though when I peered out the window the skies were calm and clear. My confusion grew as the storm's intensity increased, only it wasn't outside, it was in my head. The sound of wind and thunder grew louder and louder, almost deafening, while the footsteps approached again, as the ghost was drawing closer. And then, with a deafening crash, the door slammed shut, and the silence returned. I realized that the storm had been a warning, a forceful message. It wasn't done with me yet, and I knew that it would be wise to approach the situation with more caution. From that point forward, I tried avoiding antagonizing the phantom. When I had to address him, I did so respectfully, acknowledging this was his home once. There were other strange encounters in that apartment, like the shadow of the Hat Man that would sometimes appear. But the one who haunted my thoughts was the landlord's deceased brother. He had lived in that apartment before us, and I later learnt that it was his restless spirit that I had crossed paths with. The experience left me with a deep respect for the paranormal, and a very big sense of wariness for it too. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and my parents still live in the townhouse that we moved to in '85. Growing up, other family members would have minor experiences that could be written off. Now I'm 44 and still visit daily. My sister has 3 kids that stay with them in that home, 2 of which are younger than 5. I completely convinced myself now that there's a little boy ghost that lives there too. It was Sunday afternoon. I was at my father's place and needed to swipe some toilet paper for my apartment, so I went to grab some from the bathroom on the 2nd floor. All the bedroom doors were closed. My mum was out to church, so it was dark and quiet, and I knocked to see if there was anyone in the bathroom, and I heard, "Hello?" "Oh, sorry buddy, you're using the bathroom." "No?" So I opened the door, and the bathroom was empty. I shouted to Monk, my sister's nickname, who was in her room, and the door was closed. I asked her about where my nephew Kai was. He was in her room with the door closed. They were in there watching TV. They didn't even know I was upstairs until I knocked and shouted through the door. I swore Kai was in the bathroom and didn't even realize what happened until it was over. Thinking about it further, I realized now that the voice didn't sound like it was in the bathroom, but maybe closer. It was faint but distinct. That's why I asked if my nephew was in there using it. But the thing that gets me is that it happened in real time. I spoke and it frickin' spoke back. A bit of background on this child ghost, if that's what that is. My older nephew had an imaginary friend that he proved to me was real one day when he was young, about the same age as my nephew Kai is now. The short of it is that he described him as a little boy with black and white striped shirt. He also said he looks just like me. That kind of creeped me out. My father was born with a veil over his face. He served in the Navy, a serious man. He's seen things and doesn't talk about them too much. But he told me one thing that he sees in between the time he sleeps and waking up. He calls it twilight. And one day he said he thought my nephew was playing on his bed while he slept. He woke up and saw this little boy sitting at the end of the bed. He smiled, hopped off the bed and left the room. My father shrugged it off, but when I asked him how he looked, he told me the little boy had a black and white striped shirt on. That's all he remembered. This was years ago. My younger nephew still has an imaginary friend, but not sure he's so innocent anymore. I don't believe in coincidence, but what do you think? Because I don't have many people who I can take this seriously with on my end. Many years ago, before we had kids, my partner's father passed away. It was a tough time, of course, but as time went on, my partner often showed our toddler daughter pictures of her dad, who she affectionately called Pops. It became part of our daily routine, something my partner made a point of doing every single day. She would talk to our daughter about him, telling her stories and pointing to the photos on the wall, explaining who he was. My daughter, in her innocent toddler way, would point at the pictures too and say his name, repeating Pops with a smile, as if she somehow understood the connection, even though she'd never met him. Fast forward to a summer holiday in Portugal. This was a special place for my partner, as she'd been visiting it since she was a child. The memories of her time there with her dad were some of her fondest, and she'd always wanted to bring our daughter to experience it too. One night after we had enjoyed a lovely meal out, we were walking back along the promenade. My daughter was on my hip, giggling and chatting, when suddenly she looked over at an empty doorway in the distance, which was just a dark and quiet alcove with no one around. Out of nowhere, she pointed at the space and said, "Look, Daddy, there's Pops." I froze, unsure how to react, but my daughter just kept staring at the spot on the wall, as if she could see something we could not. There was nothing there, just an empty doorway, but she kept looking as if she had spotted something familiar. I can't explain it, but I will always wonder if she saw something. Was there some kind of connection, a moment where she saw him, where she recognized him, even though she'd never met him? It was one of those unexplainable moments that leaves you questioning what's really out there, what our little ones might be picking up on. That moment, her innocent little voice, and the way she pointed without hesitation stays with me. I cannot say for sure, but in my heart, I think maybe she did see him. And in a way, I hope she did. This happened about 13 years ago, back in 2011, when I was living in shared accommodation in a small town in England. The building was old, probably dating back to the 1700s, and had been converted into flats. I lived on the second floor, with my bedroom facing the courtyard. The whole place had a strange, eerie atmosphere to it, especially my room. It always felt unnaturally cold, even during warmer months. But I didn't think too much of it at the time. It was an old building after all. My partner at the time also experienced some unsettling things in the flat. She would often tell me that when she tried to sleep, she heard what sounded like breathing close to her ear. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or if something else was happening, but it left her feeling uneasy, especially when she was in her room alone. One day I was outside the courtyard taking a break and having a cigarette. It was in the middle of the day, and there was no one else around the house. As I looked up at my bedroom window, I noticed the curtains were only half open, leaving a small gap in between. That's when I saw it. Standing right at the window, staring down at me, was a figure. It looked like an old person, but I couldn't quite tell if it was a man or woman. I think it was a woman, but it was hard to make out any details. The figure was pale and had a faint outline, as though the light behind it was casting a shadow, making it look almost translucent. I froze. The moment the figure saw me, it quickly moved its head out of view, disappearing from the window. My heart was pounding. I rushed inside to check, but there was no one in that flat at all. The whole place was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and that image stayed with me, haunting me for days. I never spoke to anyone in that house until later, and it turned out that others had felt strange things in the flat too. They hadn't seen anything as clear as I had. Still, that moment when I saw the figure in the window was close, so real. It was something I will never forget. It was as if something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That feeling of being watched never really left the flat, and I always wondered who or what had been looking down at me that day. This happened back in 2010. It was only me and my brother home. I was playing most fun games in our dining room computer and drinking pop out of my mum's vintage Coke glass. I accidentally dropped it and it shattered. My mum was prone to exploding. My brother suggested we clean up the house and maybe she wouldn't be as mad. I agreed, because I definitely would be getting all of her anger from that day. I told him to go clean our upstairs small bathroom while I tackled the dining room where I broke the glass. Now, for you to understand the layout, if you walk in the front door, you're in the dining room. Front room to your left and computer and dining area to your right. In front of you is the kitchen, and through the kitchen to your left is our bathroom. The stairs that lead to the second floor were in the front room right around the corner. As I was cleaning up the glass, I heard running from the kitchen right by me, and when I looked, I saw my brother run up the stairs. I heard the footsteps all the way up. I saw him run by me around the corner, and I yelled up and said, "Dustin, what are you doing? I thought we should clean." And my brother popped his head out from the bathroom and said, "I am cleaning." That's when my heart dropped, because I knew for a fact no one else was home. I asked him if he heard the footsteps going upstairs, and he said, "Yeah, I thought it was you." I told him that I had in fact not gone upstairs. I hadn't even left the dining room. We carefully went up the stairs, and I brought a kitchen knife with me, and we searched all 3 rooms, closets and everything. No one was there. What I thought was my brother was not my brother, and wasn't even a real person, because I know what I saw, and that was a little boy running around the corner and running up the stairs. I wanted to share a series of unsettling experiences that have happened to me over the past few months, mostly at the hospital where my daughter has been receiving treatment. I'm hoping to get some insight into what might be going on. My first encounter happened in January. I was staying at the hospital for a month with my sick child, and during that time I started experiencing some odd events. One night a sound machine on the side table just fell off, and the light in the room flickered erratically, but no one else saw or heard anything. It was unnerving, but I tried to brush it off. However, there was a more dramatic event later. While the doctors and nurses were updating us on my daughter's condition, a set of magnets that were on the side of the bed suddenly flew across the room, as if thrown. The staff were there to witness it, but instead of reacting with alarm, they just seemed confused and chose to ignore it. My second encounter was while I was sleeping at home. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sensation of a hand running down my arm, and then a poke on my back. My husband was asleep beside me, so I assumed it was just some weird dream, or perhaps just the nerves from sleeping awkwardly. But after I dozed, I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud, "Mum!" I look around, but there's no one there. I tried to brush it off, but it felt so real, like someone was trying to get my attention. Yesterday, during a routine checkup at the hospital, my daughter was asleep during her chemo session. I was standing by her bed, talking to the nurse, and browsing through photos on the wall, when I suddenly felt a distinct tug on my sweater. I turn around expecting to see someone, but there's no one there. The tugging happened 2 more times, and each time I looked around and saw no one in the room. I spoke with one of the nurses about it, and she said, "Trust me, I believe you." She called over the child life specialist, who took me aside and said, "Come with me, I want to show you something." She led me to a door and pointed out that the door didn't lock. "See, it doesn't lock," she explained. "There's no way for the door to catch on anything. It just swings open sometimes. When we try to open it, it won't open at all. I've looked for any possible explanation but can't find one." Then the child life specialist called over another nurse who verified this story. Apparently the hospital has a ghost that likes to play pranks. And just now I had another strange experience. It's been a special day for us. My 3-year-old, who's been undergoing chemo, finally made it into the maintenance phase of her treatment. We had a small celebration in the clinic, and she got to ring the bell. Since it was a short day, we were moved into a room we don't usually stay in, one that's close to the nurse's station. While waiting for family to arrive, I went to peek out of the room to see if anyone was there yet. Sure enough, they all arrived at the same time. We're all crammed into the tiny room, chatting and laughing with my daughter before her big moment. Then out of nowhere, my daughter looked up and asked, "Uncle, did you touch me?" She grabbed her back and looked around, but no one was near her. My uncle, about a foot away, laughed and said, "No, sweetie." We all assumed it was a mistake, but I had already told the family about the strange experiences I'd been having, and when my daughter said that, everyone went quiet and exchanged looks of shock. They were starting to realize that maybe there was something going on. So that's where I'm at right now, and I'm curious if anyone has experienced anything similar. I'd really appreciate your insights. When I was 7 years old and sleeping in the attic bedroom of our old house, there was an incident. Late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, I would see figures in my room. They weren't like anything you'd see in movies. No chains, no eerie glow. Just people. They stood there silently, as if waiting for something. They didn't move towards me or make any sound. They didn't gesture or try to communicate. They simply stood, watching, as if asking, "Can you see me?" I always could. It wasn't a terrifying experience. Surprisingly, as a child, I wasn't afraid of them, even though I knew they weren't supposed to be there. Instead, I was just confused. I'd lie in bed staring at them, wondering why they came. Why are they standing there? Why won't they talk back? Why don't they come closer? Sometimes they'd fade away slowly, their figures dissolving into the shadows. Other times they'd turn and walk away, as if vanishing into a world only they could see. I never told anyone at the time. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me, or if it was just something kids weren't supposed to talk about. And yet, even now, all these years later, I remember them vividly. Their stillness, their silence, and the quiet mystery they carried. I know they were ghosts, but it leaves me speculating. Why were they just there? And what did they want with me? Hey guys, it's More here, and thank you so much for staying awake during tonight's narrations. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, you can let me know down below, and if you really liked it, maybe even you can sub and press the bell. That always helps me, as do the comments. So, I'm hoping to see you again tomorrow for even more phantom spookiness. Huge thanks as always to members and patrons whose names can't be seen on screen. They get a bunch of cool perks, and if you want to find out what those are, you'll have to follow the links in the description to do just that. But that's it from me. More links on screen now, so stay tuned. Good night.